don't understand any of the claims that were made by like anybody in this debate. And first of all, like going into my rebuttal, right? So first of all, like on the topic of brain drain and how they basically think that if you learn English, you're automatically going to flee the country, right? So whereas raised in the PY, we don't think that this is true at all, because first of all, this is set in a developing country, right? And people aren't just going to flee the country because first of all, visas aren't free, right? You need to have a certain level of proficiency to be able to get a visa to work, right? And second of all, this is happening in the developing nations. So we don't think that people even have the money to even go overseas, right? Because they don't even have the money to get like, proper education and housing, yet alone to book a flight and to, completely relocate somewhere else. So I really don't understand where this is coming from, right? And we don't think that by learning another language, like aka English or Mandarin, you're automatically going to forget, your native language. We don't think that this is true at all, as clearly seen in Malaysia, right? We clearly see that most of our people are bilingual, being able to speak, English and Malay with some sort of level of proficiency, or like also Chinese as well, right? So we don't think that learning another language in school means that you can't speak your local language. This is a very, very good assertion. And so basically we think that if this is we're talking about developing country, right? We think that it is still likely that your native language is spoken at home, right? Because we see that in a lot of countries, especially like European countries, right? They have been learning English and their native language for hundreds of years, right? And they can still speak their native language even though they have started industrializing like hundreds of years ago. So I really don't understand the analysis on how you think that if you learn English, if you learn your native language, you cannot speak it proficiently. And second of all, we think that if we're talking about developing country, right? We think that your parents are more likely to be able to speak your native language proficiently. It's like more likely to be your mother tongue, right? So we think that to learn your native language and then later go on to school to primarily use your native language again is not going to be beneficial at all, because now the only language you're going to be able to speak is your native language. And now we're going to be talking about why our impacts matter the most and how we actually bring the most material to this debate. So basically, why do you think that this is beneficial in terms of education and in terms of finding a job and lifting your country out of poverty? So I think we've already addressed the brain drain part, as this is completely not true. As we all speak English, but we're not fleeing to America, right? That's clearly not happening, right? But we think that we're not basically here to defend English or Chinese being a superior language, but we're basically here to say, facts is facts, right? Most people speak English and Chinese, right? Like over 1 billion people live in China, right? So you have a huge population who speaks that sort of language, right? Which is why it's so important for kids to learn in school, right? And second of all, we don't think that culture is going to automatically shrivel up and die just because people now stop speaking English, as basically we've already analyzed why so many people are still bilingual yet can still succeed, right? So basically, we think that why this is important is, right, because so many quality resources such as textbooks, such as assessments and resources are in English and Chinese, right? Because a huge population of the global community speaks English, right? So a lot of the knowledge that is translated and that is researched is poured and translated into English or Chinese, right? Because so many people speak that language, right? Because it's very difficult to find a quality textbook. Like, not saying that Malay textbooks are not good, right? But you clearly see that a lot of quality textbooks and a lot of major assessments that are recognized across the world are in English or Chinese, right? Because so many people speak that language, and people regard it as a very important language that they need to learn, right? And we think that second of all, another thing that was not really touched on as well is that most jobs require some level of proficiency in English for a reason, right? We think that even major debate comps are in English, such as WSDC and WUDC, doesn't mean that these native languages are necessarily bad. It's just because, the majority of the world does speak English, and I'll take it to why.
Motion clearly says that in developing countries, local languages are used as the main education primary language. So this looks like your jobs, your other workforces being in their primary language as its own. So why do you think that English is something that's inherently important for you to actually be able to get those jobs on a regular basis?
So I think the simple answer to this is to look at Malaysia, right? We clearly see that a lot of Malaysians can speak English and Chinese and Malay, right? Even though our national language is Malay, right? We still find that English is a very important language to learn because so many of our educational resources, so many of our competitions are in English, right? And our assessments are in English, and a lot of major universities require proficiency in English, which is why we think that this is important. Just look at all our debates that are happening in English, right? So basically, first of of all, we think that in terms of a developing country, it helps the country to globalize and further its outreach without actually sacrificing their culture as claimed by opposition, right? Because if you look at India, if you look at Malaysia, and if you look at so many other Southeast Asian nations, right, you clearly see that they can obviously speak their native language, but the reason why English is promoted by the Ministry of Education is because English and Mandarin is basically a global language, so many people speak it, and it's really important for communicating, especially if you work in MNCs, especially if you want to bring in foreign investors to invest in your country, right? Because we think that investors are more likely to invest in a country where they can actually communicate with the people, right? Because if you think about it, like if you are a country and you're looking to invest in a certain area or certain city, right? You want your employees, you want your local people to be able to communicate with you, because there's no point in going to a place if you're going to have a language barrier, because you're going to have to hire translators, and there's just like simply no point, right? So basically, we think that investors are more likely to invest in places where they can communicate with the people. And we think that English and Chinese is basically a very widely used language and is basically essential in order for big, large corporations to communicate, in order for investors to understand their people, and for the local people to be even hired and to even grow their economy as a whole. Because we're not saying that English is superior, we're just saying that the countries that speak English are the ones providing the money, providing the resources for these developing nations to grow in the first place, right? Because we think that so many people speak English and Chinese for a reason, like almost half the world, right? And we think that this is obviously where your main customers are, right? So we think that Mr. Beast is successful for a reason, but the reason being that he speaks English and not Malay, right? Because now you have a way bigger global outreach, with most of the world being able to understand your language, with most of the world being able to communicate with you. And with that, I've never been prouder to